No, no, it's fine. Yeah.
So, uh, oh, it's recording. I didn't hit record. A mark must have.
Mark. Okay.
Yeah, so we'll get through some things about what just leading into narcissism today and talk about it, but not in an intense line by line kind of
Right.
explication of it, which you can get in lots of lectures, even online.
Yep.
But I want to talk about it from my experience and your experience and how it comes into personal relationships. Um, and then after we go through kind of what is narcissism, how to understand it in different models of explanation, that and then I'd like to get to the point where I talk about how DBT approaches it. And what I was just saying to you is that if you asked 100 DBT therapists, how do you deal with narcissism? You'd get a blank look from a bunch of them because Marsha Linehan, from the very beginning, said basically her point of view about narcissism was it's just another person with patterns of behavior, and mostly the points of view about narcissism are that narcissist is that it's a very judgmental term, and that we really don't, DBT is not adapted to treat it, but actually people with narcissistic patterns appear in all types of treatments. So I do want to talk some, probably not get to today, but in the future about how does a narcissistic patterns show up in DBT, and how do we address them? And one of the things that I think is interesting is that because DBT is so behaviorally focused and focuses on pattern after pattern without assuming where they're coming from,
Mm-hmm.
but figures that out with each person and each instance, and then teaches skills that I think there's probably out of all the skills in the skills manual, there are dozens of them that can really target narcissistic patterns in a very helpful way. And I want to do that and give examples of that.
Okay,
So,
let me just
you
throw
know,
just really quickly before we officially start. So there's a I think that at some point it's worth looking at whether or not, like the the usefulness of pathology, in terms of the languaging around things like narcissism, borderline personality. Like what does that? How does that help us? How does that hurt us when we're thinking about client populations, when we're thinking about each other, ourselves? How does having those labels maybe limit the way we interact with patients, with each other? When we're at, and even having these kind of social mythologies around certain, client populations where there are these labels. How does maybe receiving the label or getting the label, how does that change things? How does maybe on the practitioner end, how does getting a client that has been diagnosed as, you know, narcissistic or whatever, how does that impact how you see and receive? Because I think some of what you said about what Marsha Linehan's perspective was about it just being a judgment and a pattern of behavior, I think there is something interesting to explore about, do we all contain all of these patterns to some degree or another?
hmm,
And, you know, and then if we look kind of at the biosocial model where maybe our environments are making those patterns or tendencies more or less pronounced,
hmm,
and how does maybe that perspective shift or not how we approach treatment? So I think there's that
hmm,
could be really interesting. And then just also on a very very simple level, when you talk about models of thinking about um, treatment models or whatever it is, for someone that's coming into this, and this you might want to disregard for the time being, but it might be worth at some point just being like, well, what is a model? What are the different model, like treatment models or perspectives or whatever? What do I mean when I say that? And how do they differ? How do they arise? That's maybe not for today or the next few, but I do
right.
think it's something that, like, as a more, if we're as we are trying to bring in more of the, more more of the general population into this conversation that's typically for specific, you know, specialists or professionals to have that conversation.
I think that's a really, I mean, we could jump all the way into here because this is so interesting, but so I'll just say a brief thing about it, but I'd like us to come back to it in a more concerted way because I'll just, for example, many, many years ago when I was first running an inpatient program for personality disorders, I can remember one of our patients who was very challenging to work with. And we brought in a consultant who was a specialist in borderline personality disorder. And that person interviewed that patient and then talked about that patient. And it all was coherent. It all made sense. And what happened in the interview did exemplify what the model was, the particular psychoanalytic model about borderline personality. Later in that person's treatment, we had an expert at our unit one day on dissociative identity disorder, multiple personality, in other words. And that person interviewed some of our patients, including that same patient. And I saw the interview and then talked with that person afterwards. And it was the same patient, but now they were dissociative identity disorder. And a lot of the same phenomena were explained in a very different way.
Yes.
Then you end up, and then the third time that happened, I should write this up as a case report because it's so interesting about models, is that somebody came who was an expert in PTSD. Actually, it was Judith Herman from Boston. And we had her for the day talking to us and interviewing some of our patients. And she interviewed this patient and then talked about, from a model of PTSD and trauma, how would you understand this person, and interviewed the person. And it was really as if you're taking the same person, looked at 3 different points of view, 3 different models, 3 different experts, 3 different interviews. And you'd say, holy cow, how could this be the same person? Because the models carry with them so many explanations and so many assumptions that are built in, that as soon as you say, this person meets the criteria for this, or this person fits our model in this way, you've recruited, 30% of your assumptions are already in the back of your mind. You don't even know it, but you start having a biased point of view about the individual.
Confirmation bias is so strong for all of us. And some of the implicit bias that we bring with us just about, forget the more descriptive and formal models that we bring, but then we already have, there's these cultural models that we have maybe about these different pathologies or symptomologies or whatever that we bring in about, like, okay, this is what it means to be working with someone with, DID versus PTSD versus borderline. And even without, formal training or whatever, maybe we're more or less receptive. Maybe we're bracing for difficulty. And, if you look at how most people that are practicing artists would describe and define themselves, which, is there are many overlaps and similarities, but because the environment is one that's nurturing, is one in where maybe eccentricities are more celebrated and if not encouraged, those same characteristics that are evidence of abnormality in one situation are evidence of genius in another. And so I think it's so important to think about and talk about and look at, because we do create reality with our perspective. And so, and then, and the way that and I think as an expert, as a doctor, as someone in a position of power, when you give someone a diagnosis, you either help them make sense of their reality, or you kind of condemn them to kind of a narrow reality of being broken. I mean, it's possible. So there are consequences of that, and it can follow you for your life. So just something to talk about and think about.
and as you and I've had many conversations before, and hopefully in a future podcast we'll get more into this, but the difference between a right brain perspective on the
Yes.
world and a left brain perspective. The left brain tends to categorize things
Yeah.
in a way that helps you solve a problem. So if you tend to categorize things, then you see a person,
Yes.
and your left brain takes that person and brings it into your brain and forms a representation of that person that fits a category. And then you interact with that person as if they are the category.
Yes.
And they actually aren't the category. They're actually a particular person, and they might even be a different person than they were yesterday in some ways.
Yes.
And then the right brain tends to see a particular instance as a particular instance.
Right.
So
And looks at the whole being. That
and looks at the
gestalt.
whole being, and looks
Yeah.
at the context of the being, and looks at lots of things like that. So, yeah, I think it's really the DSM diagnostic
I think we should do a
manual.
whole, yes. I
I
really,
mean, the DSM-5 diagnostic manual is a manual of categorization, and so somebody who uses it well has to have that capacity to put it on the shelf and interact with the particular person and try to wipe out some of those categorical assumptions. And I think that especially is true of something like narcissistic personality, which has a pretty bad name. Maybe not the worst in the world. Antisocial probably has the worst in the world, and maybe borderline is worse than narcissistic. But it depends who you are. So anyway, I want to talk some about a narcissistic personality disorder. First
so
of
hello,
all,
listeners.
hello. Oh, right. I guess we've begun. Oh, first, any of you who have watched on YouTube any of the podcasts would recognize my hat, which Nicole said was gray at one point. I just want you to see it's pretty much silver, but it is gray. It's sort of grayish.
I said it was
Right.
great.
Oh, look how I misunderstood that. So anyway, so I don't have it on today, and when I started wearing it about 5 podcasts ago, after a long hiatus, I wore it, and I explained then that I didn't know why I was wearing it. I mean, I knew I put it. No, it isn't like someone else put it on my head. I put it on my head, but I didn't understand where it was coming from. And then I thought, well, I should just wear it until I understand. And so now I realize there's going to be more than one understanding. But one of the understandings that I have today, because of the topic we're going to talk about, I started to think that this hat is a narcissistic accessory. That I saw myself, before we started back on this series of podcasts, I watched some of my previous podcasts, and I just thought, I am so boring. I mean, I just thought, this is like, I should be more exciting or interesting than I am. That isn't what the feedback I get, but of course I get selective feedback. People write me and say positive things sometimes, but I thought, well, maybe this hat will be like a little exciting add-on to my relatively bald head, and that might make a difference. So I just decided to not put it on today, or I could put it on but so that I just want to say, we all have narcissistic accessories to try to enhance our self-esteem. Now, let me say a little more before we get into the formal, aspect about narcissism and narcissistic disorders. For over 30 years, I've been teaching workshops on DBT, on borderline personality disorder, and in the past on transference-focused psychotherapy, object relations theory and things. So, I have a whole routine of teaching workshops, and everybody who sees me in workshops thinks, oh, he's pretty good. He's a pretty decent workshop teacher, and he knows what he's talking about, and he sounds rather like comfortable with it and everything. Let me tell you, and there maybe some of you could identify with this in your own lives, wherever you work or wherever you teach, or even in personal relationships. If I come off of a workshop day, go down to Brooklyn, let's say, or over to other places where I teach, like Italy or Sweden or some of my favorite places to teach, and then somebody comes up afterwards and says, oh my God, that was just the best workshop. You just transformed my life, or something like that. I just walk away feeling like beaming inside, like, oh, thank God, I'm worthwhile. I'm doing something valuable. I made a connection. I changed a life. I illuminated an idea. And it's kind of exciting, and I feel a little quality of euphoria, like, yes, I'm doing the right thing. It's good that I'm not an NBA basketball player where I would have really been like a third-rate thing. And I thought, I feel good. On the other hand, if I finish a workshop and somebody writes in their evaluation, usually people don't say these things out loud, but when they write evaluations and they write and say,
Nah.
I've heard other people talk about this that actually had much more interesting things to say. Jesus, or as
to the heart,
as happened in Minnesota. Can you not tell us about this topic without using four-letter words? For goodness sake. I mean, and then I feel like, oh my God, I didn't know I used that many four-letter words. I mean, and things can happen where it just destroys my whole evening, my day, and sometimes beyond that day. And it's those remarks that I remember. So these all have to do with sort of the spectrum of narcissistic features that I have. I can be elated if I get a little approval, if I get a little positive feedback, and I can be devastated or hurt. It depends on what it is and how much I care about it. Actually, I have to tell you that the person I did the most workshops with early in my career, who I've talked about in a previous podcast, Cindy.
Yes.
When she and I used to finish our intensive workshop day, and we would look through the evaluations, and there'd be maybe 50 or 60 or 80, and we'd sit there after the workshop, everybody's gone.
Yeah.
And we'd sit and read through them one at a time. And the ones that we didn't like, we would make into paper airplanes.
I just knew you were going to say that. I knew it. How did I know? Yes.
I don't know. Maybe I've said it before. I probably
you haven't. I just knew it.
You just knew that. We would take them and, with great joy, throw them across the room. And though that was quite fun to do that, it also captured a sort of minor league pathological way of coping with criticism. Because criticism can be so helpful. And yet we took it in that way, and we would just deal with it that way. And we knew we were going to deal with it, and we would have fun doing that and say, oh, well, that criticism sucks. And we'd throw it out there, right? So as a workshop teacher, just like in life in lots of situations, you're very exposed to feedback from other people. Of course, that's true even like in a dating situation or as a new member of a group or going to a new school or whatever it is, you're
being a frickin' human being.
Just being a frickin' human being. You're just like, you're alert to how am I being received? How am I coming across? Unless you're just immune to that, and people have more or less immunity, right? Mm-hmm. So I just want to say that when we talk about narcissism, I wanted to start there because I don't want to start with saying, you know what narcissism is? Narcissism is some terribly pathological thing that severely disordered people, some of whom are in hospitals, some of whom are dead, and some of whom are running the world, have, and they're pathological and they should be eliminated or something. No, it's everyday stuff. It's everyday stuff, and it can be unbelievably painful. These are like, for some people, getting a little criticism after a workshop would be like a speed bump. And on the road, and for other people, it's hitting a brick wall, and it's like, I can't go on. I can't do this anymore. I have to give up my whole idea of who I am. So those are things that have to do with how resilient are you? How resilient is your self-esteem? And narcissism is all about self-esteem. It's all about, am I a good person? Am I okay? Am I likable? Am I competent? Am I good at what I do? And that can fluctuate hour by hour and day by day. And some people have a very stable sense of they're okay, and they get some criticism and they take it in and they try to make use of it. It hurts a little bit, but it's just a little bit. Other people who are, including very competent people, a little bit of criticism can destroy them for the time being. So That's what narcissism is. And then there's healthy narcissism, and then there's pathological narcissism.
So I just want to make sure I'm understanding you as the
Yeah.
spokesperson for, the regulars. So you're saying it's a bit about like self-concept. So like if my self-concept, if how I see myself is dependent on, or if I attach my sense of self-worth to getting external validation about my project, about my outfit, about something like that, if I believe that my sense of self is somehow the same as this thing that I'm looking for validation about, then I'm more likely to be. Then there's some vulnerability because I've attached my self-worth to this external barometer.
Right. Yes. Yes. So so narcissism and sort of an investment in self. Of course, self is made up of a lot of sub-selves, right? So your self is made up of your appearance, of your sense of your body integrity. It's made up of your intelligence and your images of yourself, your images of your intelligence, your images of your talent, your images of your power, your images of your likability, all of these things. So any one of these things can become loaded with importance. So if I think that the reason I'm a person who's worthwhile in the world is because I'm beautiful, and that then somebody doesn't think I'm that beautiful, yeah, I have a lot attached to that. My sense of self has just gotten attacked. If I don't care that much about, if somebody comes up and says, God, you look sort of ugly today, or you have a lot of food that seems to have landed on your shirt, and and you go out in public. Actually, my wife just said this to me the other day. She said something like, how do you feel if people see that if you've spilled food on your shirt or your pants? I say, actually, I barely care. And because other people care.
Really different that way, because I care quite a bit. I'm gonna be straight up about that. Like,
well, yeah, you do wear more makeup than I do.
I do wear more makeup than you do, and I spend a little bit more time on my hair than you do.
That's true.
So I must say that, and if I do a little dribble, I don't want anyone to know about it. I will be quite embarrassed.
But if I spell something wrong when I'm writing, somehow I developed, probably beginning in 3rd grade, the idea that I wanted to spell really well. So if I spell something wrong when I'm writing a report now, and somebody gets back and says, well, I liked your report, though, by the way, there was a typo or there was a misspelling there, I carry that with me in a way that I wouldn't care if they said that I spilled a whole bowl of split pea soup on my shirt. I'd say, big deal. I mean, all right, people spill stuff on their shirt, but people misspell too. But so we're very attached.
I was a champion speller as a kid.
You were.
I could do that with my eyes closed. I was like an extraordinarily good speller. So someone could be like, you misspelled something, and I would be like, oh, well, oops.
Oh, you mean that was not a...
correct.
That was not me.
I wouldn't take it personally. I know I'm a great speller.
But what if you did spell something wrong? Would that be a deep insult?
No, because I'm so confident in my innate gifts as a speller.
Okay.
It wouldn't mean a thing to me.
So look at that. This is another point about narcissism, is that you can be very secure in certain aspects of yourself, and you can be very insecure in other aspects. And, and people who have narcissistic disorders sometimes can be very talented in one area of their life, and it's been focused on since they were a child. Oh, you're a brilliant actor. Oh, you're a beautiful person. Or you're a talented artist. Oh my God, you know what? He was reading The World According to Garp when he was 2, or something like that. It's like, so you grow up with this enhanced sense of, this is special about me. This is what I'm good at. And that now becomes both your ticket to being worthwhile And it also becomes the place where you could become really knocked down. So it is, if only we were all born and grew up in a way where we felt like we're okay. I'm
Unconditionally,
okay,
just
you're okay.
okay.
Yeah, we're all okay. But that isn't actually the way most of it is. At least, it's certainly not been my experience. And I think so. I guess this is a long lead into narcissism, and I wanted to put it this way because a lot of things I've seen recently written about or talked about on YouTube, there's a lot about narcissism, and what you hear rather quickly when you listen to these things are the categories. You hear the underlying psychological structure of narcissism, and then you believe, oh, well, that's what it is. That isn't what it is. That's the roadmap. That's the construction. That's the model of what narcissism is. But the experience of narcissism is different than the model. And sometimes perfectly capable people that you think of as perfectly normal have intense issues about their self-esteem that you would never know. And other people, they wear it on their sleeve. It's obvious that they feel insecure. They ask you 40 times, do you like me? Do you think I'm good? Do you like me? Do you think I'm good? Am I pretty? Am I smart? Am I talented? And those people, you know, are having an issue trying to maintain their self-esteem. Others you don't realize. What?
Do you like me?
So like is that, if that, are we in a role play, or is this like
No, really, do you
exactly.
like me? Do you think I'm okay? No, I'm kidding. I'm sorry. Go
Exactly.
ahead. Go ahead.
Exactly. Are you mad at me? Are you mad at me? Are you mad at me?
Sure?
Do you like me? Do you like me? Are you okay? Was I good at what I did? And those things are all, I want to tell you, those are all things within the normal spectrum
Yes.
of behavior and anxiety. So we aren't all just walking around like well insulated, stable, secure people with integrity and confidence. No, we're not. Like even the ones that look great at what they do. I mean, I've worked with some brilliant people in my life within the world of psychology, psychiatry, and elsewhere. And everywhere you go, even brilliant people are like extremely, you've worked with people who are actors and stuff too. Yeah. It's like, I don't know as much about that world, but they get in the news enough that you see some pretty
doesn't matter
harrowing
what
stuff.
You do. I think people are fragile, human, walking around wanting to be cared about and needing validation and all the things. I don't think no one's ever immune from the human condition.
So when we get to getting to the point where something is considered more problematic, like what's pathological narcissism, I think like other things in diagnosis, something is pathological when it begins to hurt your life, when it begins to disrupt your relationships, or it begins to hurt your work or hurt your sense of self. So it beyond a certain threshold, like let's say, what is pathological drinking? Because somebody has a glass of wine a night, that isn't necessarily pathological drinking. Someone else who has a glass of wine a night could be pathological drinking if it leads them to be just, disrupted all the time. They're so intoxicated they can't make sense of things. So it's a matter of degree. But pathological narcissism, by now, and this is different than when I started learning about it around 1980, 81, 82, and maybe before that in studies, but I'm talking about clinically. Now it seems to take the form of mainly two poles of experience. One pole is the pole of grandiosity. So that's like pathological grandiosity. The other pole is the pole of vulnerability. And so it's pathological levels of vulnerability. And some people go back and forth with these two poles. They really go back and forth. And some people are sort of more rooted in the pathological grandiosity. They're so grandiose. They're so self-invested. They have such high views of themselves and exaggerated senses of their own abilities or their own importance or their own influence that they think they are, important figures in history when no one outside their neighborhood knows who they are. I mean, and so there are people that have exaggerated sense of self-importance, exaggerated senses of how many people care about them, exaggerated senses of their influence on the world, and so there's that extreme, and that extreme can lead to great dysfunction in life, but it doesn't necessarily leads to obvious dysfunction. I mean, we have a former president who will go unnamed, but who has been talked about, as everybody knows, on TV and in the internet and newspapers, as having pathological narcissism. And he's a perfect case example of somebody who, whatever you think of his level of competence, and whatever you think of his policies, and whatever you think of his impact on the country, there's no question that he has exaggerated senses of his genius, of his looks, of his power, of the number of people who watch him when he goes and speaks. And he goes to great lengths about these things because he's sort of at that end of the spectrum of pathological grandiosity, of investing himself.
That's an interesting thing, though. I mean, because he did, against all odds, also become president. I
know. So and I think it's a good example of how people who are very accomplished, even world histories in world history, who've made a difference. That doesn't mean that they didn't have pathological grandiosity. I mean, they might have.
What makes it disproportionate to reality? I mean, when you are the leader of the free world, what makes your self-involvement disproportionate to reality?
Look,
I mean, I think there's some interesting things with the January 6th, where you could say that maybe there was a value issue there. It's an interesting thing because
it is interesting. But I'll tell you, like, let's say you're a third grade teacher in the town I grew up in Oregon, Albany, Oregon. I still remember my third grade. Mrs. Lowell was my third grade teacher. She was important to me because my second grade teacher, Mrs. Ruffner, who I had a crush on, got married during second grade, and it was not to me. And I was just still recovering from that. And Mrs. Lowell was this solid third grade teacher, right? So I would say she had a high level of competence. She was a good teacher. She was liked by her students. She had a good range. If she, though, said, you know what? I'm the best teacher that ever taught third grade in history. You might say, and then she said, I've now influenced millions of children, when actually she has 23 kids in her class each year. Or I'm being paid, by the way, millions of dollars to be a third grade teacher. I mean, in other words, there would be realistic things that are true accomplishments. And then there would be her exaggerated sense of her importance or her appeal. I mean, when Donald Trump would say, this many people were at my inauguration, and way more than were at Obama's ever, he was just wrong. I mean, that was just unrealistic. And when he said other things similar, it was unrealistic. When he said, I have huge hands, and Marco Rubio or Ted Cruz or whoever it was has tiny hands, I think all of these things are like overdoing it so that he had real accomplishments.
I know this is going to be really annoying for me, but there's this idea but because he so repeatedly enunciated his magnificence, that there's a bit of a, the more you say it, the fake it till you make it thing. That perception, I think he was acutely aware of perception, that, there might have been some degree, I don't know that he's super brilliant that way, but that there might have been some degree of strategy there, and some degree of really wanting to control the narrative. So there's a propaganda element there. And so if somebody were to make those choices, to make those statements from a posture of wanting to be politically dominant, you could say, okay, well, maybe you're a demagogue, or maybe you're a really immoral, problematic person. But is that narcissism?
Well, or is it pathological narcissism? You mean?
Right. Yeah. Right.
I think you're making a good point, and it's why actually it's a case in point of why, in fact, people should not diagnose somebody who have never met them. Because when you consider somebody's a politician, and that this can be a political strategy, in fact, he's reputed to have learned it from Roy Cohn a long time ago, and that that this kind of idea that if you just keep saying something, people will believe it, and other world leaders have done this too. So you could say maybe this is deliberately a strategy, maybe it's unconsciously a strategy, maybe he just has a good feel for a crowd, and therefore he knows the right things to say, and that's a certain skill. And all of that could be true. Therefore, it wouldn't be fair from a distance, actually, to diagnose him. However, as he stands out for the purposes of this talk, of this podcast, I would say that these features are examples. And if you knew him personally, and he acted that way one-on-one, even after you got to know him, and he talked about that and talked about himself that way in many different realms, you'd be more confident that this is really an over-the-top way to regulate self-esteem, and the need for constant admiration, constant loyalty from everybody, and the reaction to people who give even the slightest criticism or lack of loyalty, that he trashes them in different ways. Those are all go along with this idea that I have this self that's this big, that's huge, and if you think it's any smaller than that, you're an asshole and you should be shot.
Yeah.
That goes along with the picture. So the more you have of that kind of data in person with the people you know, rather than someone who's a public figure.
Right. So when you talk about this polarity between grandiosity and vulnerability, to me, the hyper-reactivity that is emblematic of, Trump when he's, banging or pulling out the tablecloth or, throwing ketchup on the wall or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. Or just that in general, like if you think of the kind of stereotype of a narcissist who can't tolerate anything less than constant adulation, that really is an indicator of deep vulnerability. So I'm assuming you'll tell me, but that these two poles are really always in a dance, and maybe one is more prevalent than the other, but the grandiosity isn't really rock solid. If it were, then it would be harder to puncture, and the reaction wouldn't be so explosive.
Well, I do think there are people of these two poles, pathological grandiosity versus vulnerability. I do think that there are people in the grandiosity pole who have more of that, who actually are more stable in life, who actually do accomplish more in life, who actually do get things done, and actually are mostly in a better mood than the person who's always vulnerable and always worried about the next thing they're going to say and whether it's going to be good enough. So I do think there are pathologically grandiose people where it works more or less. From a psychoanalytic perspective, which is just one of the models, especially the object relations model or psychoanalytic model, you'd say that pathological narcissism is a structure that is a defense against a feeling of inferiority, inadequacy, a defense against envy, a defense against painful emotions. And yet, for some people, that defense works pretty darn well for a very long time. They get through life, more or less, unless it breaks down, pretty good. And so there are pathological grandiose people, you might say, or people who have more of that pattern, and it's more stable. It's more likely to be more stable than the person, because there's other people who are also suffer from narcissistic distortions or problems, self-esteem problems, where they're just worried every time they speak that it's going to be terrible, that they're not good at what they do, and yet they care just as deeply as the pathologically grandiose person. They care just as deeply about it. It's just that they feel they always fall short. And so they're suffering from a sort of a more hidden version of pathological narcissism. It's the vulnerable type. And like I said at the beginning, There's some people who do flip back and forth between the two, or it's more obvious, but there are some people who get enough adulation, enough support, enough realistic accomplishments. They're talented enough. And certainly in the field of entertainment and acting and stuff, you get certain people who are incredibly talented, but then when you read their biographies, they were very insecure. You get great piano players like Rudolf Serkin,
Yeah.
who it's written about, that before every concert, he throws up for his whole career. He would be so anxious about how he was going to do, and then he would play with no question, brilliant, one of the great pianists in history. So these things can be hidden. By the way, I want to say one more thing. I don't want to just use Donald Trump as a sort of a case example in point, because there are people who might be out doing the work of God, the work of the people, the work of morality, whatever it is. They're suffering and sad. They're sacrificing themselves, who could also have severe pathological narcissism, but it just doesn't show up in the same way. They're showing up that they're thinking themselves as being almost like God himself, and they're including the humility. So humble people.
Well, that comes up a lot in cult, like with cult leaders, and I mean, even in the yoga communities, I think that there is a bit of that almost like rock star spirituality quality, where it's about, I am the guru, I am the generous giver, but there's an instability or a need to receive that constant feedback and reinforcement of the good enoughness, which is really interesting, because I think it does show up a lot in spiritual communities.
And one of the things that happens in some of those communities, I don't know the innards of this because I don't know any of these people myself, but having read accounts sometimes that we all have had access to, you get somebody who's a leader. So their narcissism, whether it's healthy or not, has been fueled by the fact that they've got an admiring cult of people. Okay, now their narcissism, you might say, is working. If they have feelings of inferiority that they're coping with, they're actually defending against them quite successfully by having, 100 people say, "God, thank God for you. Thank God for you. I'll give you anything." And then you start to see them taking advantage of people. Now you have another feature that's actually in DSM-5 about pathological narcissism or narcissistic personality disorder, that people can exploit this. And they can think that they're outside the usual rules. They can take advantage of people. They could have sex with everyone in the cult.
Yes.
They could ask everybody to hand over their first son to them in the cult. They could have everybody, and sometimes you see, with things like Scientology sometimes gets written about in this way, and I don't know the inside story about it. But it's sort of like, so I do think you get some leaders who very effectively mobilize a group of people or even a small segment of society who it's working for them. It's working towards their goals. But they're also, it's based on their constant work of getting admired, getting supported, having loyalists, and taking advantage sometimes of people. And that's where I think you start to see the border of pathological narcissism and antisocial features. And so you get, an overlap there. So yeah, it's I appreciate the things you're bringing up, because these things are often not brought up. If you just listen to a talk, it sounds much more canned. It sounds much more clear. You start with DSM-5 and say, well, there's these 9 characteristics, and you hear them and you say, yeah, oh yeah, right, oh yeah, I know somebody like that. And it all falls together, and you think, yep, that's the pathologically grandiose person. It's not me, but it's someone out there. And yet it's more complicated than that. There are all kinds of variations of people who are grandiose in their view of themselves, and it's partly realistic, and it's also not realistic. And so where you draw that line is not so simple, and especially if you don't actually know the person. And some people are pathologically narcissistic in one setting, but then you get them in another setting, and they aren't necessarily pathologically narcissistic. You think, wow, this person here is pretty mutual, reasonably empathic, not taking advantage of people. But then you put them out in a big audience, and it mobilizes their insecurity, which then mobilizes their narcissistic structure, and they come across as exaggerating their self-importance. So there, it's a complicated area.
Yeah.
But so just to return to where I was, and you do have pathologically grandiose people, or patterns. Let's call it patterns, because you can't define the whole person as that. And then you've got people who are more vulnerable, but they tend to use narcissistic patterns to cope with their vulnerabilities. So, no, I'm really good at this, when actually they sort of don't feel that way. And they try to dress it up. All right. Now, it's a big jump from what that is to what I want to say next. So everybody take a deep breath.
We'll follow you. We'll go.
And take a drink of Diet Coke from me. Back to my own training. I worked with Otto Kernberg for the first many years of my adult career. Even before I worked for him directly in New York, I studied him. And one of the reasons I went to New York to work for him was because I really loved his way of thinking about things, about personality disorders. And so I learned a lot about his thinking, and it's still very prominent in the world, which is amazing in itself. He's very smart. He has written a ton. He's still giving lectures. You can still find him all over YouTube at this point, talking about pathological narcissism.
And for
he came,
those of us who don't know, he is a psychoanalytic therapist.
He's a
psychoanalytic doctor in transference-focused psychotherapy, right?
Right. He's a doctor, a psychiatrist, whose specialty became personality disorders, whose career, he's best known for his work on borderline personality and then narcissistic personality, and actually even going further with looking at how narcissistic personality, people with those patterns become leaders in large organizations, including political organizations, and what the structure of those organizations was like because they were led by a narcissistic leader, and what that requires of the organization. Yeah, this would be an area you'd be interested in. He wrote a fair amount about that that's less publicized. And so Kernberg was a psychoanalyst, and a particular branch of psychoanalytic theory called object relations theory. Object relations theory is based on the idea, thank God we have GPSs now to navigate the universe, because it's a good metaphor, because it's the roadmap of the mind. Object relations theory is the roadmap of the mind that says when you are a young child, an infant, and then a toddler, you start to develop images of the self that you carry in your mind. Like, what are you like? Images of other people, what are they like? And emotions that link the two. So the basic building block of the roadmap in object relations theory that Kernberg applied was a self-representation. You might say, I'm a victim. I'm mostly a victim in life. And then an object representation, you might say, other people mostly persecute me. So you have an image of yourself as a victim, image of another person as a persecutor, and then you have fear as a linking affect, a linking emotion.
Okay,
so you've got this little.
Succinctly, I've ever heard that explained.
Oh, good. So you've got these little building blocks, and the mind, from their point of view, from Kernberg and object relations theorists, which go way back to England and with certain people that aren't worth mentioning now, but Um, that's a way of understanding how the mind works and what you have to do as you grow up. You start to have these self-representations, and then you have to realize that some of the self-representations are going to be positive, like, oh, I feel good, I'm a good person, or I did a good job. And you're going to have other self-representations that are negative, that say, oh, life sucks, this is terrible, I did a really bad job, I'm a terrible person, nobody likes me. Right. So there's good me's and bad me's swimming around in one's internal world. And then there's good objects, and others, object means other people. Mm-hmm. There's good objects and there's bad objects swimming around in that world. And one of the jobs when you're becoming 2 and 3 and 4 years old becomes that you have to protect the good things. Otherwise, the good objects and the good selves become overtaken by the negatives, and then you're devastated. So the idea is, in the mind, what do you do so that you feel like you're not actually always in danger of having these negative? This is like a video game inside the mind when you're like 2 years old, is going on between the good world and the bad world. And yet I think that video games actually come from this rather than the other way around. So you've got these things going around there, and you've got now how do you protect the good? So one way you protect the good is what Kernberg and object relations people call splitting. You keep apart the good ones and bad ones. So you say, if somebody treats you badly on a given day, you say, that's a bad person. The same person 3 days later is nice to you, you say, that's a good person. Now you've got a good person and a bad person who's actually the same person. This is challenging if you're stuck there because you're so frightened that you only want to preserve the good person.
Right. What happens if they become the bad person again?
That's right. And it could happen any moment from your point of view. And so unless the environment you grow up in pretty much nurtures you in a protective way and gives you reasonable experiences, and you start to feel confident.
Bad world.
That's right. There's a good world and bad world. So so when you're going through this is the explanation, the beginning of the explanation of what makes people, from that point of view, have borderline personality organization, the organization that Kernberg called borderline personality, because you're always splitting and you're going back and forth between idealizing people and then devaluing people. Idealizing, devaluing. There's the good people, there's the bad people, there's the good you, there's the bad you. And you've got to cope with this dilemma.
You never get to relax.
You never get to relax. You wake up on a given day and you wonder, am I going to be a good person today? Am I going to be with good people? And you see your mom has a bad look on her face. She's in a bad mood.
You got to manage. You got to go, oh, do I have to be the good self? Like, how are you going to manage? It's constant. It sounds exhausting.
So this is going on. And so this can result, if you don't start to be able to integrate, and this is the main idea in the treatment of transference-focused psychotherapy, Kernberg's model of therapy, is that the ultimate goal is that you integrate the good and bad objects, and you integrate the good and the bad self-representations. And then you have a more realistic view. You say, you know what? So-and-so is pretty nice to me sometimes, but on other days they're not so nice to me when they're in a bad mood, or when I do something they don't like. And you start to feel like, oh, all right, that's the same person. And you develop a more complex and more realistic view of human beings.
You don't think okay-ish.
Just okay-ish, one of your favorite terms. Exactly. You get okay-ish people rather than good people and bad people. You say, all right, well, they're having a bad day. So then you get a more realistic view of the world, and it's more what they call integration is the treatment of splitting. So you overcome splitting in the internal world by integrating the good self and the bad self and say, sometimes I'm pretty good and sometimes I'm not so good. Sometimes I feel better, sometimes I feel worse. And you start to realize that's reality. None of us feel good all the time. None of us are with good people all the time. I mean, it's complicated. So that's not an easy thing to do from the beginning of life. So that's the course. And if you can't get that integration, which is considered central in that model of thinking, then things keep falling apart. You have somebody says a bad thing to you and you're devastated, and then you have to hurt yourself, or you want to kill yourself, or you could start to use substances and get addicted to things. And you're sort of coping with an unimaginable and to some degree chaotic inner world of positives and negatives that are hard to regulate. Okay?
Yeah.
Now, let's jump from there. What does that have to do with narcissistic personality? This is model number one that we're talking about. What it has to do with is that one way to cope with this unmanageable split internal world is to start to assign, so to speak, and you don't do this consciously,
Right.
but you start to assign all the good self-images to yourself.
I mean, that sounds very skillful. I'm not going to lie.
That's
At
right.
least on the surface, seems like a
sounds
pretty good bet.
I know, and
You're
it
going to tell me
helps.
why I'm wrong, I know. But, like, I'm like, why not?
No.
I wish I could assign all the good things
All
to
the-
myself. It sounds like
all
fun.
the good things are like, yes, this is me.
I'm
this is
fabulous.
this is
The
me.
rest of the world is the problem. I'm amazing.
No, and in fact, when you have the bad me that feels
Yeah.
really bad, you decide to assign that to something outside yourself.
I mean, it sounds brilliant.
I've never heard it put that way, but
It just seems like
and
it
then-
would be really fun for a day. But okay, you tell me why not.
but no. The other part of this is then you look at all those bad selves or bad others and good others, and you take all of the good ones and you assign them to yourself. So all good
They're all an
qualities in the
extension
world,
of you.
they're all an extension of you. Like, look at that person's really good. It's because of my influence on them. It's because they're imitating me. It's because they love me.
Got it.
It's because they're loyal to me. So you go out there and you say, all the good in the world is me. And all the bad in the world is out there. So other people are actually a little
The
worrisome.
whole world is me, and when those good people are not loyal, then it's like a part of me is betraying myself, sort of, right? I mean, that's what it sounds like. If the part that if what the people that you've assigned is good, do something that is bad, like, no wonder that feels so terrible.
No, but it doesn't. See, this is where narcissism works to some degree, is that once you decide that when good things happen, it's because of you.
Mm-hmm.
But when bad things happen, it's because of what other people are doing. You just have to protect yourself from other people. You might have to put them down. You might have to disregard them.
Oh,
you
just
might
kind
have
of
to
discard
dismiss them.
like garbage.
You devalue them. You trash them.
Okay.
It's sort of like so-and-so's a jerk, so-and-so. And that helps protect your own sense of,
Oh,
that's not me. Me is good. They
sounds
is
lonely.
bad.
Sounds very lonely.
Can be lonely, except that you are always on the lookout for those people who admire you and think that you are good. So they can be in the inner circle. And now an inner circle and an outer circle.
Interact with another being, because if the whole world is you, it's just you and you, right? You and your admirers, you and reflections of you. You're never actually having relational experiences where you're impacted by the other, it sounds like.
Well, I think that you're right and not quite right, because
Okay.
I think that you're right if you just take this model the way I'm describing it, which I think I would just say is like a cartoon.
Okay.
Because this is like an idea and a model and a cartoon, but actually you take the person who's a pathologically narcissistic, and they are recruiting all the good stuff for themselves, including all the good ideals in the world, and say, well, Eiffel Tower, I built the Eiffel Tower. Oh, Statue of Liberty, I brought it to America. Oh, America's great, that's because of me. And et cetera, et cetera. You do all of that. You're sort of dividing up the world into the good stuff and the bad stuff, and you're saying the good stuff is me, the bad stuff is out there. I got to watch out for it. However, if you go around now, this is where it gets down to the actual person rather than the cartoon.
Yeah.
The cartoon is a model, but the person actually, like you sit with somebody who has a bad reputation as being pathologically narcissistic, and you might have a good encounter with them. where you feel like, you know what? That person does seem capable of mutuality, of empathy, of compassion, of connectedness. I didn't realize that. I thought this person was just all narcissistic, but actually this person is not always that way. So it's not fully fair. In fact, if it was the cartoon I'm talking about, they're probably untreatable in therapy. Whereas some people with real narcissism are quite treatable in therapy, but it's sometimes slow going and you have to develop a good relationship as you go along. But for today, we're going to stop in just a couple minutes and we're just going to get through. Let's just call this model number 1 before we pick up next time. And model number 1 is the psychoanalytic object relations model, the Kernberg model. I probably haven't fully given it justice. I know I haven't. I worked with Kernberg myself many years.
I've interrupted you too many times. It's my fault.
No, that's a problem with this particular kind of podcast, is that it's almost more like a lecture, and yet you've illuminated a lot of things. You've helped make it more complex, and it is more complex. It's not a simple matter. I'm going to ask you
one more question, then I'm going to shut up because I think, and I'll let you finish. But I as we finish up Model 1, like, what would motivate a narcissist, like someone who's pathologically narcissistic in Model 1 to engage in therapy? Like, if the whole world, if we're not the cartoon and the whole world is of good is an extension of me, then why might I be motivated to do the uncomfortable work of therapy?
Well, that's a good point, because they usually don't come for therapy if it's working pretty well. They come for therapy when it breaks down, when it isn't working well. They come to therapy. I mean, you can hear that the worldview of the person with pathological narcissism by this model is kind of a paranoid worldview. It's like, it's sort of like I live in a castle and there's a moat around me and all the good things in the world are in my castle. And outside that moat are all those people who wish they could take it away from me, who want to do me in, who don't like me, who have bad ideas about me, and they're evil people. And so I have to protect myself. If the moat breaks down and you start to feel like, my worldview is not working anymore. I used to be riding high. I used to be winning everything. I used to be in charge of a lot. But now, actually, what happened? It's not working anymore. So you start to get more depressed. As soon as somebody with pathological narcissism starts to get more depressed because they have a more realistic view of, maybe I'm not the greatest. Maybe some of these criticisms are true of me somehow. Maybe I'm losing my grip. It's not unusual for that person to start to have depression, even severe depression. And it's usually under those conditions that someone who's riding high with successful narcissistic functioning, most people don't seek out treatment because they don't really think the therapist has that much to offer. Because they're smarter than the therapist. They already know. They're genius. I mean, there's nobody else to go to.
Yeah, of course.
You'd have to go to another genius.
Yeah.
You'd have to go, like, I don't want to casually say what I was going to say, but you'd have to go find somebody else in the world who you think of as a genius. And even then, they're probably not as smart as you think you are. So it's a tricky thing. You do about yourself?
I do. I do.
I'm sorry to laugh but it's just that it's not that funny, really. Maybe you are the smartest. You might be the smartest person in the world.
You never know.
You never know.
But yes.
Look, I know.
Okay, that was good though. I think that was very interesting.
Yeah, and so I want to encourage people who have hung in there with this long with this kind of podcast, with this kind of teachy podcast, to write in any comments, write in any questions, subscribe or have other people subscribe if you want to hear more of these kind of things.
Write reviews, 5 stars.
Write reviews, 5-star reviews. And because one of the things that Nicole and I are going to do, we're going to talk about another model and then about DBT's approach to people with narcissism. But then we're also going to put in somewhere in one of the next 2 podcasts about this, like do some role plays where one of us is narcissistic, has pathological narcissistic features, and then see what it's like to be interacting with such a person and how you might cope with that, and then talk about that. Because maybe in your life, maybe you have somebody in your family, maybe you have a partner, maybe you yourself,
Maybe
although
it's
you're
you.
not likely to recognize it yourself, but usually we see these things in other people more. But you may wonder what to do when you're with such
A
people,
boss.
you know.
Yeah.
So we'll try to explore that. So if you have any specific questions about it, feel free to write that in too, and we'll try to incorporate that in what we do. So
Thanks
we're
so
gonna
much.
we're good. Yes, thanks for listening. We're gonna sign off now, and we'll be back at
Back
it
next week.
next week. Okay. All right. Bye.